Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV, and I'm joined by my wife, Jean Moroney Binswanger, for a question and answer period because we've had some questions left over, and we think that the people, particularly who paid in the super chat to get an answer, should get their questions answered. And there's some very interesting ones today. So I'm going to start off with this one. Did Rand ever comment on psychedelics? Yes. She commented that it's the attempt to escape from an unbearable inner state. I was looking up the quote, but I didn't have time to find it before we started, but I believe that's in Apollo and Dionysus in the 1970, let me just check because I have that much. January, part 2 is in the January 1970 issue of The Objectivist. What do I think of them? I think they're terrible. Do they have any appropriate use? No. Next question. Is physics the most philosophically corrupt of today's sciences? This is a bad question. There's a lot of questions we get on, in effect, the opposite of virtue signaling, which is vice signaling, not on the part of the questioner, but a lot of questions seem motivated by the desire for me to say, yes, this is terrible. What's going on is awful. You're right to think it's bad. And if you can't get anywhere, maybe that's the reason. We live in a rotten world. Well, that's not true. And getting to the concrete, physics is not the most philosophically corrupt of today's sciences. It's not even a contender for that. You'd have to get through, for instance, sociology before you got to physics. And what about evolutionary psychology, which is a contradiction in terms, because psychology for man is the psychology based upon volition, and evolution is based upon determinism. So it's a wonderful theory. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on applying evolution to the question of the automatic physical processes of plants and animals. And I'm a big fan of Charles Darwin, but you cannot explain people's character, people's choices on the basis of biological factors. So no, physics has big problems, and I'm one of the guys trying to point them out. And there's, in theoretical physics, at the core of particle theory, quantum mechanics, and to a lesser extent, probably relativity theory, there are conceptual confusions. But the working physicists have the equations that do describe reality and are applying them to solve real problems. So no. And now I'm also up for the next one, Jean, the way they're ordered.
I thought the next one was on empathy, and that was mine.
Oh, no, I'm not up for the next one. That's an error in the way I notated these. Yeah, that's for you. So you want to take that?
Right. So the question was, what role does empathy play in emotions, and where does it rank? Now, I assume that the real question is, what role does empathy play in managing emotions? Because otherwise, I don't understand the question. So I'll tell you, my answer to this is a little bit controversial because I think empathy is a very important, real thing, and I haven't completely convinced my husband of this. So we'll see what he says after my answer. But first, what is empathy? That's controversial too. I subscribe to the distinction made by Marshall Rosenberg between empathy and sympathy. So if someone's cat dies and you knew that cat, they're sad, and you say, "Oh, I'm sad too. That was a great cat," because you're sad. That you're both feeling the same emotion about the same thing for the same reason. That's sympathy, and there's sympathy is fine, but it's very different from empathy. Empathy is where you actually recognize the other person's feeling as caused by some deep rational value of theirs that is really underlying the feeling. And so for the cat who died, it might be something like, gee, I'm wondering if you're sad your cat died because you've lost all that companionship and that source of play during the day, which would be the values that they lost, but not if you didn't live with the cat, they wouldn't be the values you lost from the cat, you see. So empathy is very different. It's focused on, it's specifically for another person. So first of all, it's not about managing your emotions at all. It's about identifying the emotions and understanding the emotions of another person and expressing it to them. And that does have a material effect on both of your emotions, as whatever happens changes the next frame of awareness for emotions. And if you make a comment like that and you get it right, the person who has lost the cat will feel very, very visible. Like you really get how upset they are and what they lost from the cat. And you also will feel different. So you will have, because you've identified these important things, you've got this idea of play and companionship for your friend and this being a value to your friend, you will have sort of a contemplative feeling like maybe of, I think it's in the genus of love for companionship, play, and maybe some sadness because you see that your friend lost these values. But it's very different from the sense of sympathy where I lost a cat. I mean, that I liked that cat too, and I'm not going to be able to play with that cat when I come visit. So it's a different thing from sympathy, and it's a real thing, and it's Rosenberg who really innovated the idea that with empathy you need to go deeper to what are the deep rational values that are really explaining the emotion. So, which brings us to the question is, does this have any relevance to managing emotions? He coined the term self-empathy. Now, I'm not sure I really like the term self-empathy, but if we take it a step, what's the difference between self-empathy and run-of-the-mill introspection, which are both involved, I say, in managing emotions? I think introspection is the broader term. Introspection is the identification of, the states of your awareness and the causes of them. That, as Ayn Rand said, it's what do I feel and why do I feel it? Self-empathy, and that's broad. There's a lot of introspection you do that it covers casual noticing of how you feel. It covers noticing your body feelings. It covers actually trying to untangle emotions. Self-empathy is a very specific type of introspection where you not only identify what feeling you have and say the underlying evaluation, like I'm sad because the cat died, I lost the cat, but you actually go deeper to what are the fundamental values that are lost. So like for me, if it's a friend's cat died, the thing I would need an actual example of that. I don't have one right off the top of my head, but it would be a different thing if I were feeling sad. I'd probably actually be feeling sad for the friend. So it's a specific kind of introspection that goes deeper. And as to where does it rank, I would say it is the number one thing you need to learn if you want to manage your emotions, because it's getting that deep that really makes the qualitative difference. If you just introspect, say, why you're angry, and you say, well, that person did this bad thing to me, and you focus on that, that can make you angrier. That can actually intensify your emotions. But if you get to the value that you're really wanting, gee, I really wanted respect in that situation, or I really wanted, I really thought this person was my ally and I wanted to be able to trust them. you actually get grounded emotionally because you get turned away from sort of the more superficial details and realize what really matters to you. And whenever you go deep, you also then see opportunities. Well, what can I do about that?
Okay. Ayn Rand defined introspection, because we got a question coming up, metacognition versus introspection, as a process of cognition directed inward at your own consciousness. The last part is from memory. I'd have to look it up here. But it's wider than what do I feel and why do I feel it.
Yes.
Those are the two important questions for, but it also includes what am I thinking now and why am I thinking it, and am I taking into account all the information available to me?
Right. And so self-empathy is a very specific type of introspection, if we're to allow that term.
Okay, and going to the metacognition, I think metacognition is a backhanded way of talking about introspection. Introspection is a term that has been viewed with horror for 100 years. And even before that, throughout most of the history of philosophy, it's been opposed. I think that's motivated. I think the people who are the bad philosophers don't want to know and be responsible for knowing what's going on in their own minds and why they're doing what they're doing. But for the more innocent errors that are made, there has been a reaction against bad schools of introspection, which tried to introspect sensations. It's not sensations that you introspect. Metacognition means cognition about cognition. And yeah, that's one part of introspection. But as Jean points out, and as Ayn Rand stressed, what about cognition about emotion? Cognition about values. What am I feeling and why am I feeling it? What are the values at stake? So it's a backdoor recognition of the importance, the existence, probably the importance also of introspection in one form. So it's a good thing that it's used sometimes, but you should consciously inject the term introspection into it.
Right. It means that anything written about that needs some philosophical detection to see where else that wrong premise has distorted the conclusions.
Mm-hmm. I think the natural next question is the one that we have listed as next. Suppression, evasion, denial, and repression. And is evasion just a dishonest type of suppression? And what are their opposites? So let's take a more deep philosophical, psychoepistemological look at what gives rise to this question, which I must admit I didn't do until 20 minutes ago. I had certain standard objectivist answers to these, but I was thinking about Jean and my understanding of the conscious-subconscious interaction. And I think what you need to know, and I'm speaking now for me and probably Jean, but not for Ayn Rand, I think what you need to realize is you are the executive in the tower suite of the corporation that is your soul. And you don't have to manage, but you should, okay? Now, the executive doesn't go down into the filing cabinets and back when there were physical files and search for the Jenkins folder and bring it up, or search for the report on sales in the Midwest region in the last quarter. Ask someone, get me that report. Would you put it on my desk? And in the same way, you ask your subconscious for information on whatever it is, and then stuff comes up. Then you look at it and you judge it, hopefully. So if you take the viewpoint that you are the querier, you form the queries, and the judger of material that comes up from memory, from the subconscious, and from new conscious sensory observation. But we're concerned mainly with stored information now in the subconscious. If you do that, then you see there's three axes of measurement, three conceptual common denominators that are involved in the process. One is when something comes to mind, something occurs to you, you can say, no, that's not relevant. And if you were to personify your subconscious, you would say, don't send me more on that right now. I'm looking for something else. Or you could say, yes, that's very interesting. Send me more. No more on this is suppression. Yeah, more, the opposite, is attention, interest. Okay? So suppression is a conscious, volitional exclusion of more information related to a topic that you have judged to be not the topic you want to pursue at this moment. So one question is, are you saying, yeah, more, or no more of that? Another axis of measurement is, are you justified? Are you being rational when you say no more of that? So it could be James Taggart saying to his subconscious, don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me. I don't want to know about that. It's not real. And so, yes, the question is right. Evasion is just dishonest. No. It's a dishonest suppression. It's a dishonest attempt to keep certain thoughts out of consciousness, not because you think they're unimportant and a distraction from what you want to look at, but because you don't want them to be true. And you're trying to convince yourself that they're not true. So in the traditional objectivist conceptualization here is, yes, evasion is unjustified suppression, or as you say, dishonest, but the wider term is probably unjustified. So it could be justified, though. It could be, no, I'll think about what to have for dinner tomorrow night when I've finished preparing this thing that I'm working on now. That's not relevant. That's for later. And one thing about justified suppression is that you're tabling it for later. You're not saying, oh, it's not real. It doesn't, when you know it is real. I mean, maybe if you're getting over a religion, you could say, no, that's not real. But it isn't real, and you know it's not real, and you're just reminding yourself that, no, that's not real. The evasion is, I won't let it be real, which is not up to you, unfortunately, or fortunately. And the third axis is volitional or automatic. If you repeat even a justified suppression over and over enough of something that's emotionally charged, that will lead to repression. And certainly evasion, repeated over and over and over again, is going to lead to repression. Repression is the automatized barrier to entry into awareness in the first place. So your subconscious gets the message. He doesn't ever want to have any material come in about how big his nose is. That is not on. That we cannot face that, and we should cut it off at the pass, not let it. No, it's never 100% effective, but it can be automatized to a great extent. Now, it can be exclusion of something good. It can be that I take morality seriously, and of course I'm foolish to do that. Everyone laughs at me because I'm a goody two shoes and a blue nose, and that's the way I am. But I don't want to dwell on that. I don't want to know about that area where you're repressing the best within you. But it's through an error of knowledge, not an evasion. You think you cannot justify something that's actually good in you. And repeating that makes you repressed about that. And there are many different things you could repress by repeated suppression or by repeated evasion or by repeated some of each. So it gets, habits are formed, and it gets to be where it's difficult to get that thing into awareness because you've set up a automatized barrier to it getting into awareness. So even when you learn better, no, morality is subjective. I was right all along. You've got habitual automatized exclusion, and it's going to make that repressed and other areas repressed. You probably want to say something, Jean.
Yeah, so I want to say I think it's a little bit controversial to describe it that you have automatized barriers, because that's implying a mechanism that I'm not sure is real. I actually think this can probably be explained by two things, by basically what I would say creating an anti-value. When you repeatedly avoid something, you are one thing you're doing is, as you're saying no, and you are cutting or reducing the link from whatever it is you're paying attention to that thing. The link between those two things will get less. But the other thing you're doing is you're labeling the thing you're avoiding as some kind of a threat. And normally threats are relative, and I'm going to answer this in an answer to another question. They're usually sort of ephemeral. They're not things you focus on. But if you repeatedly avoid a particular threat, it grows and it becomes something you actually organize your psychology around. It's like there's this big hole in your value hierarchy, and anything that would get you close to that threat becomes something you don't want to go after. So you break all the links in that area. And I think that's what causes the phenomenon of repression. It's not that there's an active barrier. It's that there's a negative affect if you get close, which makes you want to avoid it. And there are not strong links anymore. So I think it's a kind of a simpler, more passive mechanism than the wording of a barrier. It makes it sound
That's interesting. Yeah, that's in line with your and my general idea that some of the ways the subconscious has been presented make it too much of a person in its own right. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's just a storehouse of memories.
And it's just a network. Right.
A network.
A network with valences, and that explains pretty much everything. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Do you want me to do
you're up with
women versus men?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, as women seem to be more open to emotions and less stoic than men, does this mean women are better thinkers? But this goes against my gut hunch that men are more logical, especially under pressure. Your thoughts? So I think to answer this question, first of all, we need to say what is involved in better thinking and good thinking. And the answer is both logic and values. In order to be rational, you need to be logical and you need to be in touch with your values. You cannot be rationally selfish unless you are aware of your values, which means you will be feeling emotions. So if you aren't feeling emotions, you actually are not completely aware of the values in the situation. So you need both. And biologically, it does seem that women have an edge in awareness of their emotions, and therefore it's a little easier for them to stay in touch with their values. And maybe because of that, I don't know, men find it a little easier to step aside and just look at sort of the structure of things and the logic of it, which is kind of the outline, look at things in outline. So, there does seem to be a sex difference in where people are more comfortable, which part of the thinking process they're more comfortable in. But if you want to be a good thinker, you need to do both. And this is where any kind of a collectivistic generalization of women are better thinkers or men are better thinkers is just going to fail. It's entirely up to the individual. Both men and women, every individual needs to learn both processes. And it's not enough to just learn the Mickey Mouse versions you might get, by the end of high school. This is a constant process across life of learning to understand yourself, understand your emotions, understand logic in a deeper way, understand things in terms of fundamentals. So I think the question is invalid in the idea that one or the other would be better. And I do think that there does seem to be some biological difference in what's easier for men versus women.
Well, good. That gives us something to disagree on. I don't think there's any biological difference to any psychological function, but there's a big cultural difference. And there used to be, at the point made at NBI lectures way back when, that in some cultures, the men were super emotional. Like it was said that in Italy in past centuries, men would weep openly and they had tremendous emotional content. And have you ever seen the movie Moonstruck, which is a fascinating movie with Cher and Nicolas Cage? The men, that's in an Italian subculture, and the men are the romantic, emotional, passionate ones, and the women are the hard-headed, realistic, practical ones. So I think that's cultural. I don't think it's biological. And it varies from, how affected by the culture you are and what culture you would be affected or not affected by.
I'm okay with that. I don't claim to actually know much about neuroscience. And so,
I claim to know a lot about neuroscience, but I claim to know a lot about everything, and I don't really. So,
well, what do you think about the thing that I know
that's
different
coming up here.
Go
ahead.
Is the corpus callosum is much more connected for women than for men, and that strikes me as being very relevant.
Yeah,
to the
in
kind
adulthood,
of
because
reaction.
the women have grown their corpus callosi.
So you think Italian men would have a different, if you dissected their brains? Well, that would be an interesting
or anyone
test.
brought up. Yeah, see that the error is that in much neuroscientific investigation of psychological things, which is kind of ridiculous at this stage of knowledge, eventually it will be able to be done 100 years from now, is that things that you've developed by the way you've lived are taken as innate. So, the criminals have a bigger center for X in their hippocampus or hypothalamus. Yeah, because they chose to live the life of a criminal, and that requires strengthening certain things and shrinking other things.
Right. Your point that consciousness actually acts physically on the brain means that consciousness changes the brain, and that's real. Right.
Yeah. It's called neuroplasticity.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question, it's just stated as infatuation versus romantic love, ? It's interesting because one of the things I heard from an objectivist psychologist in the 70s was that Ayn Rand had a distinction between infatuation and fascination. In fact, fascination is a word that isn't used very much, but there used to be a song, Fascination Turned to Love. Infatuation is kind of a fantasy romantic love where you imagine, you read into the object of your crush all sorts of qualities that you want to think are there, but you really don't have the evidence for. It's not a pernicious thing. It's a letting hope get ahead of knowledge. And it usually short-lived because usually the person doesn't have those qualities. Fascination is different. It's where there's one quality that you want very much in your partner, and you find someone who's got it, and you just focus on that one aspect and don't pay attention to the rest of the person who, if it's only fascination, doesn't have what you wanted. So out of context, say this woman is very concerned with justice, and that's a huge personal value to you. But she's not so big on productiveness, and that's also a huge personal value to you. Or she is big on productiveness, but you don't care that much about it, and she's not going to reciprocate. Anyway, you need more than one feature that you fall in love with. So romantic love, I think, is based upon three things. Character. It's a response to the moral character, not just one aspect, but the whole moral character, that you think this person is good and admirable. Sense of life, that this person's essential way of facing life is the same in a very concrete way as yours is. And sexual attraction, which has to do with a bunch of complex integrations made early in life, and I don't think it's fully understood. But sexual, I think I asked Ayn Rand, or she volunteered it, that being romantic meant being sexual. And her definition of, no, not her definition, but one of the ways she viewed romantic love is you can't keep your hands off the other person. So I think that's interesting. And thank you for asking that. And there's next question is yours.
Yeah, we actually skipped one of mine too. I think the more important one.
We
How
did?
can you, how can you tell if thinking is actually emotionalism? And the answer I would give to this is the same way that you tell whether thinking is logical. You need to understand what are the components of logic, components of thinking, how to even think about thinking. So, number one, absolute requirement to be able to think, you need some free crow space. So if you're emotionally overloaded, you are not thinking. You are not thinking. You actually need to have calmed down enough so that you can hear, questions occurring to you from your subconscious, little things. Does that make compute? You need to be able to hear all those signals. So if you don't have some free crow space to be able to actually query your subconscious and hear the answers.
Explain crow space.
Yes. So but all I mean is mental working space. I mean that when your mind feels overloaded, that you can't hold on to everything that you're trying to think of, that means you're out of this space. And we call it crow space because of a story with the crow that Ayn Rand wrote about in ITOE. And I'm trying to get the word crow into the language as the name for that place in your head where you hold units. So anyway, so you've got to have crow space. So if you don't have crow space, whatever you're doing, it is not thinking. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, thinking is not just thoughts going through your head. It is a purposeful process of integrating your existing knowledge with new observations to figure out something new. It's a purposeful process. So if you do not have a purpose, if you do not have something you are trying to figure out, you are not thinking. So that's another way you can tell, because emotionalism, people ruminate about things. They go over and over, and they have no purpose. It's not going anywhere. That's why it goes in circles. That's not thinking. Words are going through your mind. They may be incomplete sentences, but it's not thinking. So then, okay, if we actually get into the genus of thinking, there are two more things that you need to make sure you check for. You need to listen for those do not compute some signals and your emotions, right? It's basically the two things we're talking about before, the values and the logic. You need to be in touch. Your emotional system is designed to alert you to values that you may not be considering, that need to be brought in, that are somehow appear to be relevant to the context. You need to be listening for those and noticing them and bringing in new information if that's relevant. And then logic, logic teaches you that you need to deliberately hold the full context. And so you need to organize your knowledge and actually systematically say, have I brought in everything that's relevant here? And you need to go across the categories and do that deliberately. And if you haven't done that, you haven't been logical. So I think if you understand what is involved in thinking, you see it's a very purposeful process. It's nothing like emotionalism. And the question dissolves.
See, we Jean and I have a deeper fact value integration than is even in explicit traditional objectivism. I think, for instance, that if you had Ayn Rand's example of an immortal, indestructible, unchangeable robot who was conscious, which goes against the idea of a robot, but if you had a consciousness that had no values, had no alternatives, that everything was the same for it, it could not think. It could not grasp. It could not say what was essential, what was accidental, because all the distinctions of more effects versus less effects require a standard of value. And if there's no values to pursue, there's no point to making one kind of identification or another, or to making any identifications at all.
Right, and no purpose. If purpose is the value that you're pursuing right now. Right.
You want to know because you want something out of life. Yeah.
Yep.
There was I know it's a little over.
Yeah, there's one more that I had prepared an answer for, and there were a lot more that just came in today.
Let me just say, could you do a debate discussion with your own book over gun control and immigration? I understand you two to have radically opposing views. No, as far as I know, we have the exactly same views. I mean, maybe Yaron doesn't go as far as I do in saying there shouldn't be any border. Government should not be at the border anymore in any more presence than it is at the border between states. Shouldn't be the border between countries, shouldn't have special installations to check people. Now, I don't know if he goes along with that, but that's not an essential. We're both pro-immigration and let's say anti-gun control. So I don't know. I don't think we have any difference of note at all. So I just wanted to cover that, and it is 4:38. You want to table the other interesting questions?
Well, my only hesitation is that number 9. Yeah, the last one that we were planning for today. I have a picture set up.
Oh yeah, go ahead, do that one. That's great.
Okay, so this question said, given the different reasons for not acting to gain or keep something, shouldn't the term disvalue denote things avoided and indifference as opposed to only things avoided? So I don't totally get this question, but I have a definite opinion about the term disvalue. So I think that it's actually not that helpful a term. Whoops, hold on just a second. And I think this picture helps to show it. So I'm sharing my screen. I've got a picture of a table with my cat, Callie, trying to get some arugula. She loves arugula, and I put out the arugula to dry after I buy it, and she goes up on the table and reaches with her little paw and takes some arugula off. So now in this picture, we have two things that are of value to me. A cat, who is my pet, and arugula, which I like in my salad. And in this particular case, the cat, who is a value to me, is also a threat to one of my other values. Because if I don't catch her, she's going to grab that paper towel and the arugula is going to go all over the floor. So, when I see this picture, I have conflicting emotions. And I think that the reason I bring this up is the right way to look at the source of emotions is not that there are values that cause some emotions and disvalues that cause them. It's that there are values that cause some emotions and threats to values that cause some emotions. Values are the fundamental, and only values are the fundamental. And so, and that's what gets organized in your subconscious is values. Value significance gets organized. And the threats are kind of contextual. So something that is in fact a value to me in a different context could be a threat because it is threatening one of my other values. So I don't use the term disvalue anymore. I think it's a kind of an artificial term. And interestingly, since this person specifically raised things avoided and indifference, I'll tell you, I now, the major categorization I believe of emotions is based on what they call your attention to. And about half the basic emotions call your attention to values. So that joy calls your attention to the achievement, pride to, what you brought to the success, confidence to, your ability to get the values. Love is direct to the value. You're just contemplating the value. Grief, which feels bad. Those other ones feel good. Grief feels bad, but it draws your attention to the value. It is more fundamentally similar to those emotions than it is to fear and anger and guilt, which all call your attention to a threat. Now, what this means is that the emotions, if you're trying to get to the deep value, the value-oriented emotions are actually pretty easy because they call your attention to the value. The threat-oriented emotions do not. They call your attention to the threat. And you have to take another step to say, well, threat to what value of mine? So in the case of the picture I was showing, the arugula is what is being threatened, or my dinner is what is being threatened by the scene. And if you look at it this way, I think actually aversion is clearly over in the threat category. Why do you have aversion to something? If you go near, there would be a threat to you. So don't go near there. You need to avoid this quote unquote disvalue, not because of something inherent in it, but if you go closely, there'll be a threat. So don't go to the quicksand, have an aversion to that. What about indifference? I think indifference is just lack of value. I think it's actually over in the value oriented. You say, I'm looking around, I don't see the values. You're not seeing threats either, but it's values. I think indifference is actually the opposite of love. Love is, this is a value, and indifference is, not much. So I think that they're in two fundamental different families.
Good. Yeah. Jean has developed a whole theory of anti-values as things that you reify into black holes in your psychology that shouldn't be there. Right. And a disvalue is not supposed to be that. It's just a superficial way of saying something is harmful.
Right.
And it's harmful to what? To something you want. And that's where the attention should go, as well as to, possible threats to it, but ways around it once you know that, look, this is based on a value.
Yeah, and part of the problem, can I just say, part of the problem with disvalue is it makes it seem like it's the thing itself that's the disvalue. But what it is a threat relative to something else. It's not the thing itself. It's the relationship to the value. And that's why I think this distinction is important.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you very much to the audience for attending and letting us go on for 15 extra minutes. I will see you next week on HBTV. Goodbye for now.